52 years ago, in a small town in northern Ontario, a woman developed a mysterious condition, a condition that doctors were baffled with and that her children were terrified of, a condition as old as civilization, demonic possession. Her case is one of the most extreme that has ever been recorded, but most of it was left a secret. Her mental hospital going as far as deleting the files by fear that something would leak. But today I spoke with the only person who knows the truth about this story, because he was her son. Hello and welcome back to the Almost False podcast, where I interview regular people with incredible stories. Today I spoke with a man that grew up with a demon-possessed mom to levels that you most likely have never heard of before. He explained how the demonic came into her and how it progressively encroached itself in every area of her life to the point when she was almost not human anymore. This video is the testimony of a man who defied all odds by surviving some of the harshest conditions a child can be born in. This is the story of Michael Anthony Gagliardi.
The one time I went to the table, my mom called me, and then she came up behind me and poured the hot soup all down my shoulder. And I think I was about 3.5, 4 years old. That was my first recollection that my mother really existed and that I had to be wary of her. Because even back in those days, and as far as I can remember, she never held me, she never touched me. She never, oh, it's okay. She never said anything. She never kissed me. There was no affection whatsoever. But my sister, who's 7 years older than me, told me that before I was born, her father died. And when her father died, she was extremely heartbroken by it. And my mother's sister, so my aunt, she was a very spiritual person, into the occult, and my mother and my sister, I think, attempted to conjure their father's spirit because they missed him so badly. Well, as you know, that's forbidden, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Why? Because it works. And whether that was his spirit or not, or a demonic interpretation, pretending to be, which is, what it really is, that's what got started the oppression. And from my sister's recollection of everything that she told me, that happened right about just before I was born, and then began to increase as I got older. And like I said, there was no nurturing. She never kissed me. She never held me. Even the episode of getting soup poured on me. I remember going in the taxi. She never held me. She never touched me. We went to the doctor. Doctor looked at me. I remember the waiting room, sitting in the waiting room, in agony and pain and, whimpering away. And she never held me. She never said any encouraging words, never touched me, anything. And on the way back home. So at that moment, that really heightened my awareness of my mother as someone who is not to be trusted.
Right, and understandably.
Yes.
So she, as far as you know from what you've learned from your sister and your aunt, she was very heartbroken. She was missing her dad. She tried to contact him. And then from that point, everything started getting worse. And then you were born shortly after.
Yes.
And that there was no love. So at the point that you were born, she was already kind of losing track of reality or close to it. But I think it got even worse when you got into kindergarten. So can you try to walk us through what your childhood looked like around these years?
Yes. Everything that I just said happened in Etobicoke and Mississauga in Toronto, which are boroughs of Toronto. Like you've got Queens and you've got the Bronx. We have boroughs too. When we moved to Meaford, that was a turning point. We moved 120 miles away from all of my family, all of my dad's family, to this little tiny isolated town in northern Ontario, Canada. For what reason, I'm really not sure. I'm not sure if there was a family fallout or something. I'm sure there was, because they never came to visit us from that day on. So what began after that, now we're isolated in this tiny house. Well, it wasn't really a tiny house, but we're isolated in this tiny town and we're way up north. And as the years progress, my mother is beginning to get worse. She's very aloof. She begins talking to herself. That was the really first thing. The first thing she started saying was that she began complaining to us that she was hearing voices. That was the number one thing. She was hearing voices. There was scratching in the walls, thumping, knocking, certain things like that. She said that she was seeing little people, which is an interesting thing in Canada, but that seemed to progress, and she began to lose more and more of herself. And by the time I was 6 and 7 and 8 years old, she was pretty much in another world. She was talking to herself all the time, uh, basically unaware that my sister and I were even there. My dad was off working 5 days a week, 6 days a week, back down in Toronto, where we just moved away from. So he would go down there to Toronto, work there, and it would just be us three in the house. So this began to get worse. And probably by the time I was, 9 or 10 years old, it went up a notch.
Okay, but before we get there, I want to make sure to tie it to something that happened before, because there's so much that happened, and it's kind of hard to condense everything. But from my understanding, around the age of 7, which is what we were talking about, you were pretty much left on your own for almost everything.
Yes.
As a 7-year-old, you said your mom wasn't even aware that you and your sister existed. How are you able to take care of yourself, to eat, all that kind of stuff?
Well, I don't know how my sister did it. Well, we did had some food in the house. It wasn't very much. My dad fished when he had time off, and he hunted, so we had stuff in the freezer like that. But as far as going to the grocery store, maybe once every 2, 3 months. My dad never went to the grocery store. So I began a life of, trying to invite myself to other friends' house for a meal. And if those friends knew that, they'd go, "Oh, okay, now I get that." So I did a lot of that. And in the summertime, there was someone in our community there, because our backyards were all attached together. No one had fences back then. And there was one house in particular that had a massive garden, probably half an acre, filled with everything. And I used to go back there, this is during the summertime, go back there to the garden, pick out actually heads of lettuce and carrots and stuff, and wash them off in the creek that was right beside my neighbor's house. Wash them in the creek and eat them. And I lived in a place where it's called the Niagara Escarpment in northern Canada, and in the summer and the fall, we have tons of edible things all around. There's wild grapes and cherries and pears and apple trees galore. But most of my meals were either at friends' houses, and then whatever I could get anywhere else, usually off trees.
That's insane to me, to think that a 7-year-old would have to scavenge and get food like that. But if you were going to other people's gardens, if your mom was that kind of already completely losing track of what reality is, were the neighbors ever suspecting of anything? Did they know that you were getting food in the garden? Did you get in trouble? How did that work?
Yes, in fact, the one big huge garden that I just told you of was owned by a man named Herbie, and he was a very elderly man. He was in his 90s, and he walked with a cane, and I just stole out of his garden, and he'd be shaking his cane at me. He'd come out the back door and he'd be yelling at me. He had no teeth, so I never knew what he said. But I stole vegetables knowing that he couldn't catch me. It was kind of, a cat and mouse game, but he wasn't much of a cat. And in the wintertime, I actually stole lunches and stuff from school, from other kids' lunch bags. Because in Canada, we had a coat closet, for wintertime. You take your boots off, and up on the top shelf would be where everybody put their lunches. And during period changes, I would sneak into the closet, close the doors, grab an apple or something, and wolf it down before another class, out of somebody's lunch bag or lunch pail or something. And I remember a couple of times there were announcements on the public announcements that whoever was stealing from people's lunches, please stop, and all this kind of stuff. And I actually thought it was someone else, and it wasn't me. But later on, after hearing it so many times, I'm like, oh my gosh, they mean me, because I really didn't think I was stealing. I thought I was just kind of, existing. It was very weird to not grow up with a mother and father and be left to your own devices. When you're a child, you really have to take your world and explain it as it goes along. So I really never thought there was anything wrong with my mother. I just thought, well, she's weird, she's crazy, whatever. And we just lived our lives. And it didn't dawn on me, that how my childhood was really bad until I was suffering from severe PTSD in my 20s. And then I had to relook at my life and go, oh my gosh, and then I started telling people about it, and they said, my dude, that's not real. That's not normal.
Yeah, because you only know what you see. You only see what's around you, and that's the only thing that was with you.
Yeah, it's the proverbial, frog in the hot water. If you turn the water up 1 degree, you don't notice it, you adjust, whatever, and you're not really aware of an end game. You're just kind of surviving day to day. Your listeners could probably imagine, well, if he didn't have meals, how was he doing his own, laundry and stuff like that? Well, I didn't. Every once in a while, I'd take my clothes and throw them in the bathtub with me, and that was laundry day. So I was more or less a feral kid with a roof over his head. It was, now that I look back, it's like it was really weird.
How did the other kids perceive you? Because I'm sure if you never wash your clothes, if you steal food, I'm sure it shows in some kind of way. How was that for you in school?
Well, nobody really recognized anything because I was a really great student. I mean, I had ADHD, really, really bad. And, from what I was going through, I was very, very traumatized inside. But the way I looked at, going to school was that I had to be the best at everything. I was getting no attention at home. So that means I had some sort of value issue. And so I started over compensating at school. So I was the best at everything. I won every competition. I got straight A's. And you would think it would be the opposite, that someone who had, a deterioration of life, would be doing poorly. But I looked at it the opposite way. I wasn't hiding anything. I wasn't covering anything, but I was just being over exemplary in everything and being the best I could at everything. But no one really noticed because a lot of people that I went to school with have read my book, and they said, would have never guessed, would have never guessed. Although I did get, the clothes thing, I didn't know the etiquette for, when to wash your clothes or how dirty was dirty, when you're a kid. So, I got made fun of, got called names, for wearing dirty clothes to school. But, back then in the 70s and, early 80s, there weren't so many red flags for children. There were other children coming to school just as dirty as I was, like Pigpen on Charlie Brown, and everybody just, man, that kid's poor or whatever. It doesn't get taken care of. There was no outcry back then for kids that looked like they had issues at home.
Yeah, you mentioned something, and you said that you didn't realize that it was not normal, but also there's a part of you that understood that something was clearly wrong with your mom. And I think we haven't really talked about that. And we're going to get into it, very much, but I don't know when you started doing that, but every night you were petrified of your mom. I think your sister as well was also terrified of your mom at night.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, from what I can recall, it was probably around 9 years old, 10 years old, where things started to escalate, get really bad. I never saw my sister, even though I grew up with her. She lived in her room down the hallway with a padlock on the inside of her door, and barely ever saw her. And by 9 or 10 years old, my mom was progressively worse, screaming in the middle of the night, sitting in a chair and whacking herself with a log until she was bloody, and laughing and speaking in all kinds of different voices. And I would sit in the room with her watching TV, and she'd be talking to herself in strange voices and having conversations, and I never could pick up anything. That I realized, 20 years later, that she was speaking in different languages because I couldn't understand a word she said, and I wasn't privy to that as a child, but every night, as soon as the sun would go down, that's when things started to really escalate and get bad. And either I would go for a bike ride or something and try and get out of the house as much as I could. Sometimes I even spent the night in the park, because I didn't want to go home. So I was so terrified. But I would go home. I'd go to my room, my dresser where I kept my clothes. I filled all the drawers with bricks. So I had like some, I don't know, 20 bricks or so. And I would push the cabinet up against the armoire. It was kind of like push it up against the door. And then I slept in the same position, in the fetal position with a hockey stick, and I waited because every night, sometime around 2, 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, my mother would come and then rattle the door and try and get in. And when she couldn't, she'd go screaming down the hall. And I remember one night in particular, I was curious and I looked. She rattled the door. Once she did that, I knew that when she found she couldn't open the door, she'd start walking away. And by this time, she was obese. And how she was so seriously obese, I don't know, because we had no food, but she was obese. And I remember one night that I waited by the door, and she rattled the door. And as soon as she started to walk away, I pushed back the armoire and I looked. I creaked the door open and I looked down the hall, and she'd be screaming her head off and whacking herself in the head with a winter boot, and then go back in her room, slam the door. So this was a nightly thing that I can't even remember when it stopped. I think it only stopped when my mother actually tried to kill one of us, and then was taken away to an insane asylum in a straitjacket. That was the only time, but every night she repeatedly did this checking of my door to see if she could get in. And I waited for that every night. And I don't know what to say. I slept in that bed in the same position. I never moved all night. And that bed it had divots in it from my hip, my knee, my shoulder, my elbow, from lying in the same position every night for, I don't know, till I left home.
You mentioned that your mom tried to kill one of you. Can you explain that?
Yes. Okay. So I was in school and somebody came and knocked on the door in school, and there were, guys in suits standing there, and the teacher turned around, called my name, and said, "Could you come out into the hallway?" So I went out to the hallway. There were policemen there. And I got in the car with my neighbor, and it was his dad, picked me up. So we're heading back to our house, and he says, something happened today. And I was like, "What?" He says, "Well, your mother tried to kill your sister." And how'd that happen? Well, she was chasing her around the car outside with a butcher knife, trying to kill her. And the guy that drove me home witnessed it. So ultimately, what they did that day, they brought the mental institution over, and they put her in a straitjacket and they took her away. So once they took her away, I asked my sister, I said, "So what happened?" And my sister said that she was in the kitchen. My mother was in the kitchen. My sister was in the living room. And she heard my mother say, in a brash voice, "You're a witch, you're a witch." And my mother said that she needed to kill her because she was a witch. So she went chasing after her. And the only thing that saved my sister's life was when I left in the morning. It was a nice spring day. So there's a door, and then there's another door to the outside. And in that space is where you take off your boots. It's called a mud room. I had left that door open. I had left the exterior door open, and the swinging screen door was unlatched. So my sister was able to just grab the door and push her way through the two doors. And she said that's what saved her life, that I didn't close any of the doors, because my mother was right behind her, and she would have caught her if she had to take the time to open those doors.
Oh, okay. What was I imagine your sister was probably traumatized by that. What was your reaction after hearing it?
Well, my sister actually left that week. That was it. She went down and lived with my grandmother in Toronto, where we moved from. And my reaction, I mean, I really didn't have a reaction. It was just like, oh, yeah, okay. But when they took her away, I was more, oh my gosh, I can actually sleep tonight without having somebody trying to get in my room. I never knew her intentions. I never knew what this was. People said, well, why didn't you call in a priest, or, someone to do a demonic, exorcism? So we had no idea what we would live through this while we were kids, so we had no idea what this was. We just all thought she was crazy. And my dad was never home. So it was just the three of us. And what do you expect children to do that grow up in this? So I had a very melancholy response to it, other than the fact that I thought, oh, this is going to be great. Now I'm a minor.
How old are you?
At that time, I think when that actually happened, I think I was 13.
Okay.
I was definitely a minor. I wasn't 16, that's for sure, or 18 or anything like that. And I was still living at home by myself, but they brought her back 3 months later. You see, I found out that she signed herself in to the mental institution. And the law is if you sign yourself in, request to sign yourself in, you can sign yourself out. So, she was a very intelligent woman for being the way she was, because 3 months later, after trying to commit murder of her children, at least one of them, she was allowed back in the house. So 3 months later, she came back to the house, which was shocking. I thought that was shocking.
Yeah. I mean, it is shocking to me to hear that they would let her go back to the house in the first place. No trial, no anything, because she had signed herself in. I don't really know how this works. This was also a long time ago, so I'm not sure. But also, when she came back into the house, it got even worse.
Yes, it did get worse. And before I tell you that, I'll tell you that I had actually talked to a guy a few years back, probably about 3-4 years ago, when I first wrote the book. He told me that he was a priest in Ontario, Canada, during the 70s and early 80s. And he said to me, because I told him the story, and he said that had to have been protocol. She must have done something that was very, very strange while she was being held at the mental institution, because he said that if it was beyond their diagnosis, that's why they returned her, because they couldn't find anything wrong with her. And he said that was protocol back then, that she must have did something very, very, let's just say supernatural or paranormal. Because I'll tell you something interesting. When I was doing research for my second book and I ended up calling the mental institution, I asked for her records. And they said, oh, yeah, sure. And they said, well, when was her, when was she a patient? I said, well, during the late 70s and the early 80s. He said, oh, well, we would have burned those records. We don't have those records. But she goes, oh, just for, just let me check. You never know. So I told her the name and she goes, huh. She goes, all her records are archived off campus. And I said, oh, great. Well, I said, well, I'd like to get those. And she said, okay, well, you pay $35. Let me get them. And then I'll give you a call in a couple of days. And you can apply and pay the $35 and then get them. So I called. I didn't hear from a week. And then I called her back and I asked for the records, and someone else answered the phone and they said, "Oh, we have no records of that. We have no records of her."
So they lost the records in the few days that took, or a few.
Yes, in the week that I called back. Yeah. And I told the guy who was an exorcist, I told him that happened. And he said that would have been protocol. They would have kept the records, archived them off campus because something unusual happened while she was in their care. And it was documented as but we don't have a diagnosis of it. That's why they kept the records. But when I asked for them, saying that I was researching for a book, that's when all of a sudden they disappeared.
Yeah. I mean, that's not shocking to hear that she would have done something supernatural in the mental hospital, because she did that all the time with you.
Yes.
So it's actually something you would expect to happen. And it would make sense as a hospital or psychiatric clinic that you would not want these things to come to light, because then it kind of breaks your reputation as being able to help these people. So everything tracks for me. But let's go back to what happened when she came back home. You said that it got worse. In what way did it get worse?
Yes, it ramped up. By that time, now my sister had gone, and it was just me in the house, just me. And from the first day she came back, I remember seeing her walk through the house, and I took off. I wasn't, I was too distraught about the whole thing. But from the very next day, in the days following her return, she was now sitting in her chair, whacking herself with a piece of wood until she was all bloody every day from sunup till sundown. And I remember taking off during the daytime and coming back at, in the evening, just before the sun come down, and I would park my bike outside, and we always left our windows open. Those were back in those days. Nobody stole anything. And I could hear the thudding from her hitting herself in the chest with this log. And she would sit there, hit herself in the chest with the log, and then drop dead her leg until it hit the ground. And it was this weird repeating thing while she was talking to herself. And talking in different voices and just going on and on and on and on. And it never stopped. It never stopped. Every day it was the same thing from sunup till sundown. And the weird thing is that soon as that sun started to go down, she would get up, retreat to her room, and then the banging would start. And I would start to hear banging. And we lived the house wasn't very big at all. From the living room, it would take me 6 or 7 or 8 steps, running quickly to go and open up her door. And I would hear this banging like people were wrestling. I mean, it sounded like when me and my friend would wrestle, in his house, and we had a subfloor, and, you hear the bang, like that. You'd hear it all around the house, And I was hearing all this banging and thudding. It sounded like people rolling around on the floor, fighting for their lives. And I would run over to her room, open the door, and she'd be lying there in her bed with the covers pulled up over to her nose, and her eyes would be big like that. And then she would say, "Satan's jumping on my chest from the ceiling. And I would be like, I didn't even know what, I hear all this banging going on, and she's in her bed. And like I said, she was obese at this time, so she didn't move very fast. But every night, this circus of events happened during the daytime, whacking herself. I remember one time she found some of my belongings, and we didn't own anything because she burned everything. She stuffed all my belongings into the fireplace until the whole thing in the chimney lit on fire and everything. And a neighbor called the fire department. The fire department came. They came right into the house and started taking apart the fireplace while she was sitting there whacking herself with the thing. I mean, literally 3 feet away. And I was standing there watching the whole thing. And like I said, it didn't occur to me till 20 years later that no one said a word. The fire guys, they witnessed her all bloody on her chest right here from whacking herself, and never said a word. They put out the fire and they left. You know, that was kind of the way things were in the 70s and 80s. It was shh. Nobody talks about anything. Nobody says anything bad about anybody, and everything was hush hush.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to tell you about our extra content on Locals. It's where you can hear the beginning of our conversations, learn the practical applications of the testimonies, and get hours worth of other bonus content. All of that, plus the regular episodes without any ads. It's free to join, so why don't you come check it out by going to almostfalse.locals.com by downloading the Locals app. The links are in the description. Now let's get back to the story. I am left with very few words at everything that you say in your story. It's unbelievable. But here's an interesting question that I have for you. At this point, your mom completely lost it. It didn't feel like it was her even in the body. But were there ever times you would see glimpses of humanity? And did she ever come back to her sentence for like brief moments?
Yes, 2 times. And I'll tell you, like I said, my mother never coddled me. She never held me. She never kissed me. My whole entire childhood, she never talked to me. She never conversed with me because she was oppressed I was such a young age when she was oppressed and then became possessed that I never knew her. We never had conversations. There were 2 times where she actually spoke to me coherently and intelligently. And both times were when I was in the house and I was about to leave somewhere. And she said to me, she didn't try to get my attention, anything. She was like, and singing and whistling. And then she said, it's like she broke out of it all. She stopped hitting herself. And she said to me, they're coming into me and running up the back of my spine. That's how they get into me. And then, and then here she goes again. 2 times she said that to me. The very exact same thing. She said that to me, like 30-second increments. And that's the only time I heard her actually speak to me in her normal voice. They're the only 2 times I can ever remember in my entire childhood.
So your mom clearly was aware that something demonic was happening. She was saying, Satan is jumping on my chest. They're coming into me through my spine. She was aware that something demonic was happening. But at this time, I think you were 16, and your mentality was understandably that if you don't kill her first, she's going to kill you, like she tried with your sister. And everything kind of points to that. And it seems like you had no help from anybody anywhere. Mental Institute wasn't doing anything. The police wasn't doing anything. You didn't really have any other option. So that was your mentality. And there came one night where the opportunity kind of came. And I think that's the biggest shifting point of your whole story. Can you explain everything that you can remember from that night?
Yeah. Well, up until that moment, I was breaking down mentally, emotionally. Now my grades were starting to fail for the first time ever in my entire, because I couldn't hold it all anymore. I just couldn't deal with it. I mean, I was being broken down on every level, mentally, emotionally. I mean, I didn't feel like a person. I felt like a shell. And, it got so bad that, my father couldn't leave food in the house at all because she was ravenously eating everything up. So he put a chain on the freezer downstairs. And one afternoon, this was in the summertime, I was coming home, with my bike, and we have, the freezer was downstairs in the basement, and there's 2 ways to get into the basement. One, you can come from the outside, you go downstairs, you open the door, and you're in the basement. And then while you're in the basement, you can go up another set of stairs that leads to that mud room that I had explained before. And then you go into the living room. That's the in-house entrance. So I came home one day and, I was headed down to the basement for whatever reason, probably to chop wood or whatever. And I see my mother, she's bending over and she's got a hacksaw and she's trying to hack a chain off the freezer. And the first thing I said to her, it was the only thing I could think of, was I just yelled out, "Hey!" and she was all bent over, and she just cocked her head, and she looked at me, and she snarled, and her hair, because this woman didn't take care of herself, as you can imagine. She stunk like hell. Her hair was all overgrown. Her bangs were like down to here. All of her teeth were all broken and serrated so bad that her tongue, she would wag her tongue at me from time to time, go like this at me. And all her tongue was serrated and bleeding all on the sides of the edge from all her broken teeth. All her teeth were all broken and chipped, the front ones everywhere. So she turned around, she snarled at me, and she dropped the hacksaw and then went running upstairs. And I went to chase her upstairs because, like you mentioned, this was it for me. I can't deal with this anymore. I'm going to have a breakdown. And I didn't even know what a breakdown or anything was that. All I knew is that it had to be her or me. Somebody was going to get killed sooner or later. And she ran up the stairs, and I chased her up the stairs. And at this point, I'm like 16. I'm like 5'10". I weigh like 125 pounds, 130 pounds. I'm nimble, I'm fast and quick. She beat me upstairs. She ran into her room. She slammed the door so hard that all the windows in the house were reverberating like that. I could hear the front windows pulsating. I thought they were going to explode. And I went to open her door. She was pressing up against the door. The door was bowing, and I could hear it cracking. She was like testing the capacity of the door. And I thought to myself, well, if she's pressing on the door, she must be, with her back against the door, pushing with her feet, because that's the stance of power. You wouldn't stand in front of it and go like that, because you get pushed back. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to open this door, and I'm just sitting there waiting. Like, I can hear her breathing. She's like, it kind of like breathing, snarling, gnarling. I mean, this isn't my mother. This isn't my mother. And I'm waiting for a minute, and then I hear the cracks kind of go as she releases the pressure off the door. And I rub my hands together. I remember that so vividly because I was sweating. I rubbed my hands together, and I went to open the door, and the doorknob was turning. So I turned it, and I whipped it open real quick. And immediately our eyes met. We must have been maybe 3 feet away from each other. And they were just pools of black. They were pools of black. My mother had hazel eyes, or basically green eyes. They were more on the green side than the brown side. So they really stood out, So when you looked at my mother, you could see, wow, you got really nice eyes. And I saw nothing. All I saw was the glint of the reflection of light on her eyes. They were just black balls. And, I've read stuff that people have seen that kind of stuff, and it sounds so stupid and so cliche, but I don't know how else to explain it. There was no pupil. There was no iris. There was no white. It was all black. And at that moment, she had a handful of pennies she had in her hand, and she whipped the pennies at my face, and I turned around and I began running. She ran after me. I was just bolted. I went around the corner. I opened the door, and I ran outside, and I ran out onto the street. And then I could hear slam. She slammed her bedroom door again. She went into her bedroom, slammed her door, and all the windows again went boom, boom, boom. And I could see this from the driveway. I was looking at the front window thinking, oh my gosh, that thing's going to just pulsate like a speaker and just snap and just bust straight out. Anyway, I was trying to process what I saw in the driveway. And I couldn't even say my name. I was trying to say a word. I was like, you know that's real deep trauma when you can't get a hold of your speech and you can't control your own body. You know that's really deep. That's a fear. That's a deep fear. But when I was standing out there, I realized that my dad was in town. I think it was on a Saturday, so he had to have been in town, and I knew where he was. So fortunately, our telephone used to be right inside. You go through the mud room, and then you open the door to the living room, and it was right there on the wall. So as soon as you open the door, you could just reach your hand in and grab it, and it had a long cord on it. So I reached in, make sure, the coast was clear. I grabbed the phone and I went outside on the patio and I called my dad. And when the lady answered the phone, I couldn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. I was like, and I heard the lady scream my father's name. He comes to the phone. I once again, I can't say anything. And he says, okay, I'm coming. He knew it was me. So he gets home, he pulls in the driveway. He's like, what's going on? What happened? I can't say anything. I'm still like this. So he begins to head toward the door, the front door. I'm following right behind him because I'm like, this is it. This has got to end. Soon as we both get in the door, my mother comes out from behind the wall, jumps my dad. Now we're talking about an obese woman here. She's 5 feet between 5 feet and 5'2". She is very small, but obese. She jumps him, takes my dad, who's 5'8", and in the prime of his life back then, takes him to the ground, throws him to the ground, jumps on top of him and starts scratching his face and howling and gnarling like an animal. I'm like watching it like, oh, she's going to kill my dad. And my dad happens to get up and then he runs outside and I run out after him. And I'm standing in the driveway with my dad, who was just defeated horribly. She threw him down like he weighed nothing, and started scratching and clawing at his face. And my dad couldn't say anything. He was out there, like, wow, that's not my wife. That's not the woman I married. And so the phone was still outside. My dad called the police department. The police called the mental institution, and all of these people came out. And my mother was talking to the policeman like normal. He was like, so what happened here? He goes, oh, nothing happened here, officer. I'm not exactly sure why you're here. And I'm hearing my mother talk in a normal female, feminine voice. And I'm hearing her, and I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. I'm standing in the driveway ready to freaking blow my brains out because I'm so confused as to what is going on. Anyway, a couple minutes later, they take her away. And I believe when they took her away, they shielded me. Now that I remember that, they kind of shielded me off. And maybe they didn't want me to see my mother in a straitjacket. I don't know what it was. But I believe that they did that. I remember not being able to see her, wanting to see her, but not being able to see her. And they brought her out in a straitjacket and they took her away. And they took her back to the mental institution. And 3 months later, they sent her back.
So she did the same thing. She signed herself in again?
Yes. And 3 months later, she came back.
I have so many questions, and I'm sure most of them you probably don't have answers to, but my questions are, how did she speak in a normal voice when she never did, when the officers were there? How was she able to control your dad, throw him down? But I think a question that you probably can answer is, where was your dad during all these years? Because the last time we heard about your dad, it was in the early years, and you said he was working like 5 days a week in Toronto, would come back a few days a week. But at this point, he didn't seem to be aware at all of what was happening with her. Was he in your life at all?
Yeah, no, he still wasn't in her life. He was still working the same job, still far away. And he just thought she was crazy and ignored her and didn't pay any attention. One thing you got to understand about my father, and I stand with him, but he grew up in World War II. He grew up with shelling. He saw his father being shot at by the Nazis. They were trying to take shelter. They lived in Italy. They're from Italy. My father and his family were trying to take shelter. He was just a little boy. A bomb went off, blew their donkey up, and all the guts went on him and all the kids. He had a very traumatic life. So, I understand now why he didn't react to any of it. And he just thought, well, she was crazy, because he didn't spend time. He had an outlet. And I will answer to your question about the first, how she threw my dad down, how she was able to speak in a normal voice. And I know this now because demonic entities that take possession of somebody, all they want is to hide. They just want to hide. So they can block people's feelings. They can block people's feelings from not knowing when they're being possessed. And they allowed my mother to speak in that moment, you know. And then when they took her, who knows what happened? But they don't go anywhere. They're still in her. They just have control. You see, this is why they run up the back of the spine and into the head, because that's the central nervous system of control of the whole body is the spine, is the spinal cord. And I've done research on this for the last 30 years that this is what the demons do. There's an actual process of them going in and taking control of the central nervous system. That's why people, they have weird movements and stuff. So this is what I believed about my mother. The longer it went on, the more demons that were allowed to take refuge in her. And the more voices I heard, the more different kind of voices, the more dialects I heard when she would be, sitting there talking all day, arguing, with seemingly no one, and her voice is changing, and this is what they do. This is what they do.
There's a few things that make sense to me. So if there was, if the demon were to inhabit a part of the body specifically, and it was to inhabit a part of the body that would take control of the limbs, it would be the spinal cord. So that actually makes sense. And that's what your mom said. So those two things correlate. The other thing also that I think makes sense is you mentioning that essentially when the police came, the demon kind of, they laid low and allowed your mom to come back to the surface. And she was blacking out for most of the time. So she legitimately would have been confused. And that's something that I hear in episodes of very intense demonic possession, where the person actually loses control and the demon takes over. The person completely blacks out and has no idea. So she would have come back to her senses and literally would have been confused as to what have happened. So those two things make sense to me. I should still have last question about your dad, because I want to make sure that we really see that angle. So what you said, he was leaving most of the time, was working away, but would he ever come back to the house? Would he sleep in the same room as your mom? Did he have another place that he was staying at? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, when he'd come home for usually 2 days, maybe one night and 2 days. And he had his own room because we had a 4-bedroom house. He had his own room. So, and even if he was at home, he was never home. He was either fishing, he went out hunting. That's something that he loved. He loved being out in nature and fishing and hunting and doing that kind of thing. But, like I said, my dad, he only went to grade 4, because he was in the war in Italy. He was a refugee for years, in Sabaudia and he came to the United States, when he was 19 years old. He somehow got on a boat in Gibraltar and came over to Canada through Halifax, through Nova Scotia. But my dad had a very traumatic life. And, even today, we don't talk about this stuff. We've never talked about it. And my dad's 90 years old now, and I wouldn't dare bring that up. I don't want him to have to go through any of that. He knows he failed. He knows he failed me. I told him could have done better, but that's neither here nor there. There's a thing called forgiveness. And I have forgiven my father for that, because I know that he went through trauma as a child, and he wasn't all there, for lack of a better word, not crazy, but, had problems adapting. He couldn't speak the language. He came to a new country. Those are all hard things to deal with,
Yeah. So the story is not quite over though, because you did eventually leave. That was the breaking point that night, the incident that happened with your mom, and when your dad came to try to help. And it wasn't that long after that you decided to leave. I don't know how old you were. And can you explain how that unfolded, what your thought process was, why you decided to leave at that time? and not before? And also, right before you left, what happened?
I had to wait for till I was 18 to leave. I mean, that's legally. So, I bided my time at friends' houses, and then I came up with a plan. I came up with a plan to go down to Toronto, back down to Toronto, to get a job, stay with my sister, make a pile of money, and then I was going to leave for California and get into the music business because I was a musician, guitar player. So I did that. I went down for a year. I collected a bunch of money when I was 18, came back home, um, spent a few months with a bunch of friends of mine who I had convinced them they all wanted to go to California too. I said, okay, I made a plan. 6 months from now, we're leaving. We're going to California in April 1987. So as it drew closer, everybody bailed until the last guy 1 week before. And I said, I'm not bailing. I'm going. So on Easter, it was Good Friday. I got on a bus in Buffalo, New York. I got on a bus and I got dropped off in California on the Monday. Took 3 days to get there. So it was the Monday after Easter Sunday, 1987, that I landed in California. And, I thought that was going to be, I wanted to leave Canada completely. I didn't want anything to do with anything of that place. I was so traumatized, by 18, 19 years old, I had severe insomnia. I was dealing with bulimia. I was 6'1". I weighed 123 pounds and had a 23-inch waist. I was anorexic and bulimic. I was throwing up all the time. I hated myself. I had no value. And when I went to California, I experienced 15 minutes of bliss when I sat on the beach in Santa Monica at 11 a.m. I put my feet in the sand. No one was on the beach at that point, just a few stragglers. I had my gym bag I took with me. I put it on the sand. I laid down and I said, no one knows where I am. This is the greatest moment of my life. No one knows where I am. I've got no bills. I've got no nothing. I'm accountable to no one. It lasted about 15 minutes. And then I went, now what am I going to do? So, and I was still having severe insomnia. Could only sleep 2 or 3 hours at a time because I was shaking. I still, to this day, at 56 years old, I still shake and shudder inside like this, like, like that happens to me every night and every morning. I wake up with the same shuddering and shaking, and I get paralysis of the face where it gets all numb. It gets all numb, and that's how I wake up. I wake up with my face on fire. That's how I wake up because I feel the pain of my face on fire. So the PTSD was so terrible what I went through for so many years that the PTSD came out differently. As a child, I suppressed it all. By the time I was 19, I started having horrific nightmares, insomnia, and bulimia. The next 10 years, I started having depression. The next 10 years, I started to have depression, anxiety, and suicidal tendencies. And now it's switched back to shuddering, shaking, and facial paralysis. And, when it's like if you've ever seen videos of the guys from World War One that had shell shock, they're like, all shaking and setting. That's because their system is so traumatized that it can't operate properly. And that's what I have. And I do it. I have shuddering incidences throughout the day. I've had them while we've been talking. At one point, while we've been talking, I thought I was going to pass out, which I have on numerous occasions during high levels of stress. I've been in the hospital so many times. I have a record that's as long as my arm, and you would expect that from somebody with PTSD from this situation. So, anyone who writes me and says that I don't believe your story, shame on you, because I have all the scars and the medical records to prove it.
I feel so bad for you. But I command you for doing what you do because I know that this is hard for you. It's always hard for somebody to relive traumatic events to talk about them, and yet you still go
Yes.
out and you talk about your story because you care about the people that it can help. And I very much commend you for that, and I thank you for doing it because I can't imagine what you're feeling. But about your right about leaving, I believe you went back to see your mom one last time.
Yes.
And that's a very intriguing incident or event. Can you explain that?
Yes. My dad sold the house, set my mother up with an apartment about a half an hour in a town called Owen Sound, which was about a half an hour from where I grew up in Meaford, Ontario, Canada. And my dad said, "You want to see your mother one more time before you go?" And I said, "Sure." I think this was like 7 days before I left, and I happened to be in town, so I said, "Yeah, let's go." So he brought me there. I went up. I knocked on the door. My mother came to the door. She opened up the door. Didn't even look at me, like she knew it was me. Didn't even look at me. She opened the door and turned around. Never even looked at. We never met eye contact. I walked in. She just started walking. I followed her. She went into her bedroom. She sat on the side of her bed. She reached over. I remember this so clearly. She reached over into a nightstand, got out a letter, handed me a letter, laid down back on the bed, and then started. And I said, "That's it. I'm not doing this." And I immediately walked away. But I mean, it just triggered me. I was like starting to shake immediately, and I went down and my dad asked how it went, and I didn't even say a word. And I read the letter. I think maybe when I got to California, I think I read it. And it was very weird. At that time, I really didn't have an understanding of it. And, over the last, well, that'd be 40 years now, I've moved so many times and I've packed the letter somewhere and I don't know where it is. I can't find it. I have it, but I'd have to tear everything apart. So I'm thinking one day I'm going to do the conclusion of my book, the part three, which will be the conclusion, and will have that letter actually the way she wrote it. So I'll do a photocopy of it and put it in a book for everyone to read because it was really weird. It was really weird. And that's why I didn't pay much attention to it because I was like, just more of the same, just more of the same. But now I believe that there's things in there that need to be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely could be something very interesting in there. Whether it makes sense or not, I'm not sure, but it's interesting to revisit at the very least.
So I'm going to include this letter in the final. There's one passage I do remember reading it, and that's where I stopped because I got angry. And it said, "Don't be a wild man." That was the one thing that I read that I was like, whatever. And then I put it away. And I haven't seen the letter in like 30 years, but I know I have it. It's packed away somewhere. So I will find it.
So one thing that I don't think we heard yet is how you kind of figured these things out later. You said you didn't really understand what was happening in the moment, but at some point you were able to understand. So my question is two-sided. How much did you know about demons and what was happening when you were living with your mom? And what is the puzzle piece that was able to help you understand all of it?
Great question. Um, while we were going through it, nothing. But did I fear the demonic world? Yes. Very, 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 very much so. I heard things in the house. I saw things. I was terrified of the unknown. What did I know what it was? I have any clue? Not a clue. The thing that opened up my eyes was it was a twofold process. Um, by the time I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I was really having a hard time with life. Wanted to kill myself. And I was like, why am I like this? Why am I like this? What is wrong with me? And then I started to think about my childhood. Then I started to do research. When I started to do research, I landed on, I don't know how it happened, but I landed on the transcripts of the Anneliese Michel case from the early 70s and mid 70s, the exorcism case. And I studied all of the tapes and transcripts available for that. And everything I read and everything I heard from the eyewitnesses pointed to my mother. It was like the exact same thing. The exact same thing. Even the things that they said were the exact same thing. And when I studied all that, I went, oh my gosh, this explains everything. I didn't have to read one thing and go, well, that kind of fits. It was like I was reading my mother's accounts and everything that was said and the eyewitnesses and everything that the eyewitnesses said that they saw and heard, and the screaming and the yelling and the crazy repetitive movements over and over and over and over and over and over, day after day, night after night. It was all the same. And then I started to look up other exorcism cases, other demonic possession cases, and found out that they all have there's the same set of natures involved in what demonic possession, true demonic possession is. Like, for instance, I heard my mother speak in so many different voices that I understand and can identify the gate. You know how people speak at a gate? Somebody speaks like Rodney Dangerfield, they talk real fast. That's called a gate. You can tell their ups and downs, their ups and downs. I understood and could examine, after hearing my mother's, all those speech patterns when she was speaking demonically. I was able to hear all those speech patterns when Anneliese Michel was saying, even though they were in German, I could hear all the gate of the speech patterns. It was all the same. And that was shocking to me, how close those cases were. And then as I began to look into other stuff and see other cases and have other explanations and other eyewitnesses to other cases that heard this and that and this and that and this and that, it just cemented for me. It put all the puzzle pieces came together, and I went, oh my God, my mother was demonically possessed by not one, not two, but a legion of non-stop demonic entities, spirits of the Nephilim, spirits of the fallen ones from the antediluvian world. This is what they do. All the speech patterns were the same, their hatred, their everything. They even used the same phrases. And every real exorcism case that I came across that had a transcript or had an audio to, they're all the same. They were all just like my mother, all of them.
So you mentioned the word legion, and I know where you get that. It's from this passage in the Bible, the demon-possessed man in the tombs. So if anybody's interested, there's a lot of similarities between Michael's story and what his mom was dealing with and the man in the tombs. But you've mentioned the Bible many times throughout your story, and it seems like it kind of is what helps you understand a lot of these things. How did you go from demonic possession to Jesus and the Bible? Because we haven't really heard how you made that connection, but how did that happen?
How I realized was that after many years, I realized that there was more to life than just me and how I perceived it. And I had just gotten married, and my wife and I broke up. We got separated for 3 months. My wife called me and told me that she was pregnant, and my world fell apart. I said, not only am I messed up in the head, but I'm going to mess up another generation of people, be it my own child. I could not bear that at all. So one day while going to see her, I moved out of the house and I went to see her. I gave her my truck. I gave her everything I had. I felt so guilty. I was on a bus and I was going down Ventura Boulevard by Taft High School. And I started crying on the bus in front of about 40 people. And I started crying. And I said, God, whoever you are, I've made a mess of my life. Please come into my life. You please come into my life and make things right, and I'll serve you. And at that very moment, I didn't hear a voice. There was no light. I felt a peace inside of me. And I know that was at the moment that the angels rejoiced in heaven, because that's what it says. When any sinner repents, the angels rejoice in heaven. And when I turned my face back around to the people that I saw who were staring at me, who for that minute watching me cry, I turned around to them with a smile on my face. And I don't know what happened to me. I don't know what happened to me, but when I got to my bus stop, I got off the bus, I ran to my wife's house, knocked on the door. I said, you're not going to believe, I don't know what happened to me. I sat her down on the couch. I said, something happened to me and I don't know what it is. I don't know what happened. And I told her, we got back together a week later. And I told her, I've got this thirst for God. I want to know who God is. So I went out once again. I knew nothing about nothing. I went out and I rented Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth. And I was watching the movie and my wife was in the kitchen cooking. And it got to the point, because it's a red letter movie. So everything Jesus says is that he said. And then he gets to the point where he goes, and the sheep know my voice. And the second he said that, I dropped everything and I yelled to my wife. I said, come in here, come in here, come in here. She came into the room. I said, that's who I met on the bus. I didn't hear an audible voice, but I know that the shepherd called me. And a week later, after asking a friend of mine who I knew went to church, I asked him what church he went to. I went to that church the next week later. I was sitting there in the seat with my wife, and the man said, the guy talking to the sermon, I'll never forget, it was David Miller from Church of Rocky Peak in Simi Valley. And he said, you have to be born again. And then he read the passage with Nicodemus. And Jesus said, don't marvel that you have to be born again. It's like the wind. You don't know where it comes, and you don't know where it goes. And I turned to my wife and I said, that's what happened to me. I was born again. That is what happened to me, because my eyes were open and I'm not the same man that I used to be.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, from that moment on, my wife came to know the Lord, gave her heart to the Lord a couple months later from my witness. And then everyone in her family, one after other over the years. Now everyone in her side of the family is Christian, a born again Christian.
That is such a beautiful story. And it's heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time because of what you had to go through and where it led you. But I want to ask, how has your life changed? Because I know some of the PTSD is still here, but in what way did your life change after giving your life to Jesus?
Well, it gave me an inner peace. Like Jesus says, peace I give unto you, not as the world gives peace do I give unto you. And that is the thing that now I don't care. I don't care about dying. I don't care about being famous. I don't care about being wealthy. I don't care about any of those things, because on that one day on that bus, I found a pearl in the ground and I gave everything I had to buy that pearl so that I could have that. Because I know that everything else fails in comparison. And do I still have the issues and the scars of PTSD? Yeah, I deal with them every day. It's horrible. It's just horrible. Sometimes, at least once a day, I ask the Lord, just take me. I don't know if I can keep doing this anymore. But you know what? As long as God has me telling the story I wish that someone was telling this story when I was back in that I could go, oh, that's what's happening to me, and that's what my kids told me. You got to tell your story because you wish somebody would pull you out of that mire. So I'm hoping that by telling my story, someone else out there will have the guts to stand up and say, I believe in Christ. I believe in Jesus. And I'm going to fight against this, because the enemy wants to kill and destroy. That's all he wants. He wants to kill and destroy every one of us. And he's got targets on some of us on our backs because he knows we're going to be effective for the kingdom.
Yeah. There might be someone today that is watching that has had a story like that. And I'm sure that it's a very, I don't know if comforting is even the right word, but beyond that, to know that, they're not alone. So,
yes.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I always ask a question similar to this whenever we end the interviews, because the people that I talk to have a bunch of different stories. And I think that we learn lessons through our challenges and what is in front of us. And you haven't had so many of them. I want to ask, in your opinion, what do you think is the most important lesson that we can learn from your story?
That God can take you, Christ can take you from wherever you've been, however low you think of yourself, however low the value is that you think you have, you're wrong. Because Christ can bring anybody from anywhere out of anything and dust you off, give you white robes, and be invited to come and live with him in heaven. There's no man so far away. Not even if you're watching this and you're a Satanist. No one's too far from the hand of God. That's what repentance is all about. That's what forgiveness is all about. And he says that he will cast away all your sins and they will be no more. And he will not remember them anymore. And you'll be white as snow. And see, that's what the thing that I had to deal with, is that I thought I had no value. That was the crushing thing. That's why I worked so hard to be of value, being an academic and trying to be the captain of every team and win everything. But you know what got me? Nothing. Got you nothing. Because the crowns of this world, throw them on the ground before the King of Kings. They don't matter. They don't matter. So no matter how low you think you are and how unvaluable you think you are, the God who created you in the heavens has a love for you so deep and so valuable that he would give his only son to die the worst torment possible invented on this planet so that you and I could go to heaven. That's what every man's story is about.
Thanks for watching this episode of Yamos Falls Podcast. If you want to hear about another case of demonic possession, then click on the video right here. It's a story that sounds straight out of a horror movie, but unlike the movies, this one ends well. If you're not on YouTube, the link will be in the description. See you there. Stay blessed.